We learned the argument between Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda and the Chachamim regarding a tree. When it was planted originally, it was done with no particular intention, just to be a tree. And then later on, they decided to worship it as Avodah Zarah. And the Chachamim say it has not become Avodah Zarah at all. And because at this stage, there's no tfisas yidei adam, there's no human involvement. And Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says no, that any new growth on that tree becomes Avodah Zarah. And the logic is there was tfisas adam when you planted it. So what do the Chachamim hold? How can the Chachamim say it does not become Avodah Zarah when the fact is you planted the trees, even though at that time you didn't have anything in mind, but now you do, so related back to the tfisas adam. So Rashi says, interesting pshat, which Tosfos doesn't agree with, but Rashi says that when you plant a tree, it's merely seeds. There's no tree yet in existence. So the tree only comes about a while later when it grows. And at that stage, there's no tfisas yidei adam. And the fact that you planted seeds, that's not called tfisas yidei adam because there's no tree at that time. So we are up to the Gemara now. We are up to about 7 lines at the top of the page. Vav Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara here. Tani Tana Kamed Rav Sheshes. They were learning before Rav Sheshes. They were learning the Braisa before Rav Sheshes. And it says the following. We're by 8 lines from the top of the page. Ha'akum ha'oivdim es ha'horim. If a goy worships mountains, that's hagavoyes or hills, hein mutarin, they are permitted. And we actually had a machlekes showing before. When we say permitted, how far do we go? Just that it's no avodah zarah at all, or it's like avodah zarah, but it's not really awesome. But you don't have to destroy it. Why are mountains exempt? There's 2 ways of learning pshat, and this is what the Gemara is going to discuss. Why is it that a mountain does not become avodah zarah? Is the issue here because it's mechuber, it's attached to the ground, attached to, so it's not portable at all, and therefore that's why it's not an avodah zarah? Or is the idea because there was no tfisas yidei adam, there was no intervention by a human because this is how it was created? 2 ways of learning, and we'll soon see the nafkamina. So what happened was the goy worshipped the mountains, the hills, they're mutter. The oivdein b'saif, and those who worship the mountains, they will be punished. So even though the mountain itself is not avodah zarah, the worshippers will be punished. And why will they be punished? Rabbeinu Tam learned because the mountain is avodah zarah. Just it doesn't have many of the dinim, including the din that you have to destroy it. But it's avodah zarah. Therefore, if you worship it, you will be punished. However, Rashi and the Ri and other Rishonim learned the mountain is not avodah zarah. But because you, in your mind, are treating it like avodah zarah, and you are worshiping it, therefore you will get punished. So then it continues. What about vesazroyim vesayirakas? What about grains or vegetables, and you worship them? Hein asurin, they are forbidden, and uvaydein b'sayif, and those who actually worship them obviously will get punished, will get saif. So the Gemara wants to know. So the Gemara Amalek, the Amalach Mani. Let's understand what's going on here. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehudi, this follows. Why is it that the vegetables are forbidden? You're telling me the vegetables are forbidden. The vegetables and the grains are growing from the ground. So why should they be any more forbidden in Avodah Zarah than the mountains themselves? So we answered, the Amalach Mani, the author here is Rabbi Yossi bar Yehudi. This follows the view of Rabbi Yossi bar Yehudi. The Amar, who is of the opinion that Ilan, a tree, Shinatoy, you planted it normally, but it'll be safe avodah if later on, as it's growing, you decide to worship it, asur, it is forbidden. So this brisa must be following Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. Says the Gemara, because that's the only way we can say that it's avodah zarah, the new growth. Says the Gemara, why? The lukme, why don't we just say is simply, we're talking about over here, why can't we just say that we're talking about a case where the vegetables and the grains were planted for the sake of avodah zarah? Comes to mountains, obviously it's not shaykh, but the plants it is, and therefore it's Avodah Zarah. And goes with Rabbanon, and will follow Rabbanon. Isn't it always better to learn that the Braisa follows the Rabbanon rather than a lone opinion like Rabbi Yosef Yehuda? So don't even think so. The Tony, because we're drawing a contrast, right? We're drawing a contrast. The mountain is mutter, but the plants are asa. So they have to be in a similar circumstance, and yet they're different halachas. So if you're going to tell me that the plants were planted for the sake of Avodah Zarah, it has nothing to do with the case of the mountains. Totally different. What are you drawing a comparison or a contrast when they're totally unrelated? Don't even think so. The Tani, the Ha, would learn the laws of a mountain. The mountain never planted. You don't plant it, it comes by itself. You didn't plant it for this reason. We learned in the Braisa. What happens? Okay, the mountain is not Avodah Zarah, it's mutter. What happens if Avnei Har Shenidalgu? You have stones that dislodged from the mountain by itself. No Maise occurred, because if you would have carved it out of the mountain, it's a whole different story. And you had in mind Avodah Zarah, of course it's Avodah Zarah. It fell out on its own. The question is, what is the status of these stones? And we'll soon see the machlekes, and we'll see why. Bnei Rabchia, the children of Rabchia, who are known as Rabbi Yehuda and Chizkiya, they Rabbi Yechanan had an argument. Rabbi Yechanan, Chad Omar, one of them said Asudus, it is forbidden, and the Chad Omar Mutaris, one of them said that it is permitted. And the Gemara now explains. My timer demand Omar Mutaris, the one that said it's permitted. Why is it permitted? It's no longer a mechuber. If the vart is that it's mechuber, the reason why a mountain is Avodah Zarah because of mechuber, then now it's dislodged. It's no longer mechuber. It should become Avodah Zarah. Why should it be any different? So the Gemara explains if the reason why a mountain is mutter is not because of being mechuber, is because there's no tfisa de adam, no human intervention. And here again, the rocks, the boulders dislodged on their own. So there is no human intervention, and therefore there's no Avodah Zarah here. That's the basis of Chizkiah. And the other one says the main thing is mechuber, and these are no longer mechuber, and that's why it's awesome. And now the Gemara explains where they get it from. So the Gemara says, why is one that says mutter keha? We compare it to a mountain. Mahar, just like a mountain, does not become Avodah Zarah. And you know why? She'ein boy tfisas yidei adam. There's no human hand involved. Umut, and therefore it's permitted. Is avhani, these rocks, they dislodged on their own. She'ein tfisas yidei adam. Umutar, they're permitted. Says the Gemara, 1 second. How can you compare? Maybe the reason for a mountain is malahar shekem mechuber. Maybe the reason why a mountain is not Avodah Zarah is because it's attached, it's mechuber. And the pasuk says alehem alahar, but not that which is mechuber to the ground. And therefore, these rocks that have been dislodged, they are no longer mechuber, they're no longer attached. They should become Avodah Zarah. Says no, that cannot be the reason because of mechuber. Behemoth techiach. We know that if you bow down to a behemoth, the behemoth itself does not become Avodah Zarah. Now, behemoth is not mechuber, so why doesn't it become Avodah Zarah? It can only be one possible reason, because there's no tfisas yidei adam, no human intervention. So therefore, by mountain as well, the reason is because there's no human intervention. So if the rocks dislodge, it's the same thing. Says the Gemara, 1 second. Mala behema, you know why behema does not become Avodah Zarah? She came balas chaim. It's very chashuv, and because it's very chashuv and it's a living being, therefore it doesn't become Avodah Zarah. Nothing to do with either reason. Says the Gemara, how yechir? So how come a mountain doesn't become Avodah Zarah? There's no life in there. Nothing chashuv. Is the chazar hadin? We go back and forth between the mountain and an animal, and we say, look, what do they both have in common? Each chumrah does not apply to the other one. It can't be because of mechuber, because animals don't have mechuber. It can't be because they're alive, mountains not alive. So what do they both have in common? There's no human intervention. And that's why it's permitted. So af kol she'ein behen fish the adam, anything else that has no human intervention, like a rock dislodging, is permitted. Says the Gemara, 1 second. You know at least what they both have in common, the mountain and the animal, she came and they are now the same form the way they started out. And because there was no shini, no change underwent, they didn't undergo any changes. So therefore, we say that they're not Avodah Zarah. They're still connected to the original state, whatever they were. But in this case over here, when the rock was dislodged from the mountain, it's no longer the way it was originally. So maybe it should become Avodah Zarah. So you're right. Ela we learned out from a behema balas mum, a behema that has a mum. All right, a behemoth has a mum. Also, if you bow down to worship it, it does not become avodah zarah. And yet the behemoth is no longer in the original form. It now has a blemish, and yet it does not become avodah zarah. So it shows that even though it might have changed, it still does not become avodah zarah. So we learn between a behemoth and a mountain. You'll tell me behemoth is chashuv, I'll tell you a mountain. You'll tell me a mountain is mechuber, I'll tell you a behemoth. The tzad hashava is there's no tfisas le'adam, and the fact that it went through a change doesn't bother us. Says the Gemara, or another possibility
is what's the Gemara resolved now that the behemoth can be a avodah zarah?
Gemara resolves that the basis for a mountain not becoming avodah zarah is because there's no tfisas yedei adam, there's no human intervention, and that same reason applies to behemoth. And you want to argue with me about a behemoth it didn't go through a change? Then I'll tell you we're talking about a behemoth balmum. A behemoth balmum went through a change. It's no longer the same behemoth it was originally, and yet it does not become avodah zarah. Why? Because there's no human intervention. So the same thing with the rock that was dislodged from the mountain, even though now it's different than before. Before it was part of a mountain, now it's on its own. It doesn't matter. Because there's no tfisah de'adam from its creation, and even now it only happened on its own. It rolled off on its own, and therefore there's no avodah zarah.
So how would the Gemara relate to in India where the cows are worshipped?
What about it? They're not avodah zarah.
Of course they are.
Of course they're not.
They're worshipped. Absolutely avodah zarah. They're worshipped.
Did you hear what we just learned in the Gemara? We just learned that an animal does not become avodah zarah, despite the fact that multitudes of people worship it. Doesn't make the animal avodah zarah. It becomes avodah zarah only when they do a ma'isa, like they shechted, or they do something to the animal, the shem avodah zarah. But just worshiping an animal doesn't make the animal avodah zarah. They don't have the power like Havdul by Hektish. When you makdir something, the animal becomes Kaddish. But when you say that this should become, we had yesterday in Gemara a few days ago, if you say that this should become avodah zarah, nothing. If you say this animal avodah zarah, nothing happens at all.
So you could
go through it.
So you could shecht it and have it for a Shabbos meal.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. There'll be a question in the Gemara soon. What are these things that don't become avodah zarah? Can you use it for a mitzvah? So, for Shabbos meal to be yaitz, a mitzvah might come under the same question, as we'll soon see.
We discussed that if you could use a couple of weeks ago, if you could just use a shofar from an animal that was an avodah zarah for
that's not in the Gemara. That Gemara is actually in Rosh Hashanah Daf Chav Tes. The Gemara is not here in avodah zarah. We might have discussed it, but it's not here.
Yeah, we'll discuss
it in today's Gemara. Sorry, it's actually in tomorrow's Gemara. In tomorrow's Gemara, we'll talk about tzitzis or chatzotzris, and some say you mean shofar. And the Gemara here will argue the Gemara Rosh Hashanah that we had clearly allowed to, because mitzvah lav lahanas nitten. Okay, let's go back to the Gemara here. Or inami, another possibility is from behemoth tama, from a normal behemoth, but an elon yavesh, a tree that dried up. A tree that dried up is no longer in its original form, does not become avodah zarah. We're following the view of the Chachamim. The Chacham hold that if you did not plant a tree for the sake of avodah zarah, if you did, obviously it is avodah zarah. And even though later on you decide to make avodah zarah, it does not become avodah zarah. Even though the tree dried, so the chayt is different than before, it does not. And it must be because there's no tfisas yidei adam. And Rashi then explains interestingly why is there no tfisas yidei adam? Because as I said before, when you planted the seed in the ground, that's not called a tree, because at that stage there's no tree involved. And according to Rabbi Yosef ben Yehuda, says Rashi, there's also a possibility to have a tree with no tfisas yidei adam if the tree grew on its own. Taisa asked the question, what do you mean? So the tree, another tree, left some seeds there. So the original tree was planted by people. So Taisa says they're talking about, according to Rashi, in a forest. Nobody ever planted the trees in a forest. They came from B'riyas Ha'olam. So there's no tfisas yidei adam. So the Gemara Manda also, so what's the logic behind the ones that also? They hold that the reason why a mountain is mutter is because it's mechuber, and a rock that was dislodged is no longer mechuber. It does become avodah zarah. That's why it says in the pasuk shaket shaktenu v'tayim t'savenu, that you should be meshaket everything. The afagav the asim medina lateda, even though according to halacha it should be mutter, Like Tasya, don't learn it out from there. The mountain is mutter. It came, even though it came from something that's mutter, everything else, it should be mutter, it's not. Because shakets to shaketenu. Expand the Isser of shekets, of Avodah Zarah, and we're going to say that the mountain is not Avodah Zarah, because it's Bechuber. Says the Gemara, to Stein, let's conclude, the Bnei Rabchia was, now we don't know who said what. Let's conclude of the children of Chia, Rabbi Yuna, Chizkiah, the Shoru, that are permitted. Boy, Chizkiah asked an interesting question. What happens if Zokaf Beya Lishtach was like, took an egg, and you put it upwards, made it vertical, it's lying horizontally on the table, you split it up vertically, with intention to bow down to it. Mahu. Is it Avodah Zarah or not? Because right now we thought, what was the case? What happened? You intended to worship it, and and you did worship it. Now remember, an egg, there's no tfisas in the other. It comes from the hen on its own. There's no human intervention. So we thought it's talking about a case where you wanted to worship it, you actually did worship it, and according to the first opinion, it's mutter because it's not. There's no tfisas in the other. They come a boile, and the question is that and therefore, and the question is, you did something to the egg. Is that action by picking it up considered an action or not? Because if you did nothing to the egg, you just worshipped it. You said, "I want this egg to be Avodah Zarah," and you worship it would not become Avodah Zarah. Why not? Why won't it become Avodah Zarah? It's not attached or anything. It's not Avodah Zarah because there's no fish in the other. And since the Bchi is the one who asked the question, the children of Bchi asked the question, it's quite obvious that they're the ones who are matter. He's asking only if you lift the egg. You have a mice is actually an act or not. If he didn't pick up the egg, let me say, surely it's not awesome. Shema Mino is not clear evidence that the children of Bchi are the ones who say that's permitted, that as long as there's no tfisas the adam, no human hand involved, it is mutter. Says you might no rise here one way or another. Why? I can tell you that the question was very different than you just said. I can tell you that what that children maybe want to ask it. So what's the case over here? The hishtach v'lo. Here we're talking about a case where they had an egg. In a normal case, if they just bowed down to the egg, afagav the loizokfa, you didn't lift it up, asur will be asur. Maybe the Bnei Rabchia hold that it's asur because they say the only reason why a mountain is mutter is because it's mechuber. This is not mechuber, it's not attached, so therefore it becomes asur. Maybe. And what's the question? You intended to worship it, but you didn't. You did a pula, you lifted the egg, you made a vertical, and you had a kavana, but you didn't do anything. And what happens? Now we're going to have the Gemara later on. Interesting machlekes Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva. If a yid makes an avodah zarah but doesn't bow down to it, is it already avodah zarah or not? And one opinion says if a yid does it straight away, you did an avodah, it's avodah zarah. Rabbi Akiva says no. When it comes to a yid versus a goy, by goy it's straight away, but by yid we'll say we believe the yid will do tshuva till the last moment. Kol zman the yid did not bow down to it, there's no avodah zarah. So you want to ask the question, what's if the way you're learning pshat, that it took an egg, they wanted to worship it, but they didn't. So what's the question? Who cares? What's the question? If you follow Rabbi Shmuel, it's avodah zarah. If you follow Rabbi Akiva, it's not avodah zarah. There's no question. It's just an argument. Ulama, according to who's he asking it? Straight away, even before they worship it, then asura. As soon as you have the egg and you had a mind to worship it, it's avodah zarah. And until you actually worship it, you didn't. So it's not avodah zarah. So his question was as follows. Line up. When you in the case you did something, right? You lifted the egg, you made a vertical to worship it. You did not worship it yet, but what happened was you didn't worship it. Along came a goy, and the goy bowed down to it. And that's the question. Because you prepared this for Avodah Zarah, and the goy bowed down to it, do we say that the goy is your shliach or not? And why? Yes, we have a precedent, but a little bit different case. But the question is, do we draw a simile between this case and that other case? What's the other case? He took a brick and stood it up to worship it. The boy came along, going and worshiped it. Asur is asur. It is asur. And why is it also? The Gemara later on says, because as if the goy did your shlichus, which is a whole subject in its own right, whether a goy can be a shlich of a yid, but when it comes to Avodah Zarah, we say as if he did a shlichus. The kame boile, and this is his question. Leveino the mikras kevasa. When it comes to a brick, when you stand it up, it's very tall. It's much longer than wide, and therefore when you lift it up, it becomes now very, very tall, so it becomes prominent and becomes visible. So therefore we say, if the guy bows down to it, it's Avodah Zarah. Avabeya, the question about an egg is not very tall. Even when you lift it up, stand it up, it's a bit taller than lying down, but not much. Or maybe they're also, even though it's not so noticeable, it's still Avodah Zarah. That's the question. So we have no proof one way or another which way the children of Reb Chia, or what they were what they were matir or not. Boy, Ramacham, another question. We're going to ask a series of shilas here now regarding Avodah Zarah. Hamishtach lahar. We said before, you bow down to a mountain. The mountain is not Avodah Zarah. The question is avonov, the stones of that mountain, maul mizbech. Can you use it for mizbech? Because when it comes to behema, if you worship a behema, we said before, it does not become Avodah Zarah, and yet you cannot offer up this behema as a korban. We learned from a pasuk beginning of Vayikra min behema and atzoyim and abakar, says min to tell you not all the tzoyim, only some of them. If one was set aside for Avodah Zarah, one was worshipped Avodah Zarah, or one committed bestiality, none of those animals can be brought up as Avodah Zarah. So we see that the laws for the korban. So we see that the laws of korban, l'gevoya to Hashem, are far more stricter than the laws of what we can have hana from a nut. So we're going to ask the question, just like by behemoth, it's usher to the Eibishter. What about a rock from this mountain that was worshipped? Can you use it for the Mizbech or not? Or let's say a korban mincha flour. Can you use the wheat for korban mincha? Okay, the wheat was growing. It's not Avodah Zarah, but now you took it from there. Do we say it's pasnish? Do we say that it's sort of, it's disrespectful? As the Navi said, if you produce this present this to your officer, will they be appeased? Will they be pleased? So, what about the stones from the Mizbech? And the Shaili is, yes, never, do we say that the same thing that happens to an animal applies here as well? And that is now, as far as the Abish is concerned, you cannot bring it on the Mizbech. Or do we say no, that there is no sort, when it comes to mountain different than an animal, even for the Abish, it's all right. You can use it for Yayin Nesach, for Nesachim, you can use it for Mincha and for Mizbech. And in Tim Tzalaim, if you can tell me yesh never mechuba that you cannot use it for korban mincha, the wheat, or you cannot use the wine for Nesachim, okay, because that's directly involved in a korban. What about a step removed? What about machshirim of a korban? That which helps you, enables you to bring a korban, like mizbech. In Tim Tzalaim yesh never been mechuba. Eitzel gavoya. What about machshiri korban? What about that which you use to make a korban, like a mizbech? Korban dummy, is that tree like a korban? Or not. Omar Rava, so Rava came along and said, Kal v'chaymer. We're going to learn from Esnan. Esnan, you gave a gift to this harlot for, you gave her a gift, right, for the intimacy. That, what you gave her, cannot be used on the Mizbech. As the Pasuk says, that whatever you give to a Leisavi Esnan Zoyna, the gift that you give to a Zoyna, you cannot bring it Beis Hashem. And Beis Hashem sounds like not only you cannot use it as a korban, you cannot even use it for maintenance of the Beis Hamikdash. In other words, even machshirim are forbidden. But what is l'chayda? What's it talking about there? The l'chayda is talking about a tolush, something which has been separated. What about something which is mechuber, attached, which is mutter for Yisro? Is that also included in this Isser of an Esnan or not? Says the Gemara, ma esna, madach esna, shemuter betolush lehedyed. That the Torah says you cannot use the gift you give to an esna for the mizbech, but for an ordinary person, they could have enough from it. And yet also b'mechuba legavoya, yet you cannot bring it to the mizbech. even if it's mechuber, let's say like wine. How do you know that? Because nowhere does the pasuk make a distinction between whether it's talush or whether mechuber. So we're going to say it's across the board. Whether it's talush, whether it's mechuber attached, you cannot use it on the Beis Hamikdash. It's mutter for a hedyet, but Beis Hamikdash, all cases are us. And how do I know that? It says "Leisavi esna zayna b'chikelu loish not Beis Hashem, loish not talush, loish not mechuber." It makes no distinction between the two. So never, when it comes to a case of Avodah Zarah, which is far stricter than an Esna, why should us had it been Tolush, it would be us even for an ordinary person. So we see that never is far stricter than the gift you give to an Esna. So Ein Din, surely the din should be here. Then surely when it comes to never, you should not be able to use on the Beis Hamikdash something, even though it's mechuber. Al Kavachaymer from Esna. So his student, Rab's student, said to him, the same token you made this Kavachaymer because the Torah didn't spell it out, so you made some presumptions. I can presume the other way around. Let's make the Kavachaymer exactly the opposite, as follows. Neved is forbidden to an ordinary person, right? If it's Polish. If it was used for Avodah Zarah, you cannot have any anah. And yet, the Torah only says that you're not allowed to have hana from a tolush. But the Torah clearly says elehayim al harim, that the mount themselves are mutter. The Torah doesn't spell out for a hedyet or for a gvoya. So you read the pasuk that even for the Eibishter you can use a mechuber. Shenemar elehayim al harim. And the pasuk makes no distinction. It makes no difference if it's for an ordinary person or it's for the Eibishter. In all instances, it seems from there that if it's mechuber, it's all right, even though it's never. So esnan, an esnan which is much lighter, you can't enjoy the talish. Then surely ain't a din that when it comes to mechuber, it should be mutter for everybody, including gavaya. Shmutter mechuber legavaya. What do you do with the pasuk? It says Beis Hashem alekecha. Don't bring it to Beis Hashem alekecha, which sounds like like a mechuber and so on. What do you do with the pasuk? Because we think right now a bais, a house, is a mechuber. So it sounds like from the pasuk itself, we're talking about even mechuber. And it says that the present of an esnan, don't give it to Beis Hashem. That means don't give your Beis Hashem, your mechuber, to as an esnan. So clearly, an esnan cannot give mechuber to Hashem. So he says, no, we'll learn something else from it altogether. In other words, we think he's trying to say that maybe the pasuk is talking about you gave a gift, a house to this zayna. That house he cannot donate to the Beis Hamikdash. So clearly that mechuber cannot be used. So I'll tell you, it doesn't bother me. He said, you know what? We'll use it for something else. Basically, don't need it for. Look at Tanya. We learn Beis Hashem lekecha that your house prat lepora she'ena bal the bais. Nothing to do with what she's donating. What is aser a behemoth, a carbon? But if she wants to donate a parah aduma with pleasure, because the parah aduma is not brought within Beis Hashem alekecha, all the activities of the parah aduma is done outside the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, the gift that you gave to an esnan is permitted. Nothing to do with mechuber. David Abelezer and the Chachamim say again, nothing to do with mechuber. It has to do with the rabbis es harikuyim. Beis Hashem alekecha is that if she gave you gold, something attached, and you want to donate it so they can gold plate some parts of the Beis Hamikdash and the Bech, that you're not allowed to. Again, so nothing to do with mechuber. So Avinu Yeshua asks Rava, just like you want to be machmer because the Torah doesn't make any distinctions, equally I can be mekel because the Torah doesn't make any distinctions. Rava said to him, I'm trying to be machmer and tell you that you don't bring it to the Beis Hamikdash, don't use it. If it was never, even though it was mechuber for hedyet mutter, but not for the Beis Hamikdash, you want to be lenient. You want to be mekel altogether and say for sure. Even the esna, you want to say that if it's mechuber, you can donate it. Whenever you have a choice of being mekel or being machmer, we are always machmer. Says the Gemara. Is that true? You tell me every time there's a kavachaymer, we always try to be stricter, not more lenient. Let me ask you a question. There's a famous machlekes between Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Lezer. We had in Gemara Pesachim. and that is that comes Pesach on a Sunday, is Erev Pesach on a Shabbos. The din is you can shech the Korban Pesach, we do all these malachas on Shabbos to enable the Korban Pesach. What about a person that's Tameh, and it's day number 7 on Shabbos, and before he can qualify to bring the Korban Pesach, he needs to receive the Parah Adumah, the Hazah. Now, Mahatayda, there's no problem. What's the problem sprinkling someone on Shabbos? But with Rabbanan, there's an issue, and the issue is you're fixing up a person. It's like Makav Patish, Masak and Gavra. You're fixing up a person who's also with Rabbanan. So the question is, can you do that on Shabbos Erev Pesach? Because if you don't do that, you won't be able to bring your Korban Pesach. So he's a machlekes Rabbi Lezer and Racham, and he goes as follows: Rabbi Lezer, the opinion, ma Korban Pesach, which you're allowed to bring on Shabbos. Surely, which is the Isa Deraisa, Shechting, and all that. Surely a Korban, the Hazah, which is Rabbanan, surely should be allowed to on Shabbos, and therefore this person must bring a Korban Pesach. And Rabbi Lezer is machmer. He used the Kavachayim to be machmer. Rabbi Kiva counters that by saying, maybe we should say the opposite. Madach, you're not allowed to do the sprinkling on Shabbos Erev Pesach. We don't move the shvus away. And so Rabbanan, surely we should not allow him to do Korban Pesach. And let's be makel because of Kulia. He doesn't have to bring Korban Pesach. So we see from here there's an argument tonight whether a Kal V'Chayim necessarily has to be machmer, or you can also be makel. So the Gemara Vazor, the Pesach, the Gemara keep it. Rabbi Lezer, the Chumra, the Chumra become mechayev leila gavra. Rabbi Lezer mechayev the person. But Rabbi Akiva lekula, Rabbi Akiva is lekula or pata, and hipatis. So we see that that Kal V'Chayim don't necessarily have to be stricter. Says the Gemara, because Parich Rabbi Akiva lekula, and Rabbi Akiva is trying to be mekel. Rabbi Akiva is trying to say that you don't have to bring a korban. The Tanam we learned. Hey Shiv Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva told Rabbi Lezer, you want to be machman, tell the person he has to bring a korban Pesach, because and you make Kal V'Chayim. If you're shecht on Shabbos, surely you do a Issa D'Rabbanan Shabbos. So Rabbi Akiva said that maybe you go way around. I'll say the way around. Madach Hazor, which is only a shvus. Yet he cannot do that on Shabbos. Shabbos shchita she deraisa lekoskin should be done on Shabbos. So the chayim we see it's a machlek is whether Kal V'Chayim can only be machri, can be makel as well. So the Gemara explains very interestingly that Rabbi Akiva didn't really mean a word that he said. Rabbi Eliezer told them many years ago that you're not permitted to do Hazor on Shabbos, but he forgot. And Rabbi Akiva didn't want to embarrass Rabbi Eliezer to say, "Oh, you forgot. You told it differently." So he wanted to make a Kal V'Chayim, and the Kal V'Chayim he stressed that that you're allowed to go ahead and that what do you call it? That he wants to say you don't do Hazor on Shabbos, so therefore sure, and then he'll say with such a certainty, and therefore maybe you shouldn't shecht on Shabbos Pesach either. It will sort of trigger Rabbi Elezer's mind a memory. Oh yeah, Takish. Shvus, you're not allowed to do the Shvus of Hazor on Shabbos. That was Rabbi Akiva's intention. He never intended to actually have a real Kal V'Chayim. Says the Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer is one taught Rabbi Akiva that you cannot do the Hazor. He just forgot it. Rabbi Akiva wanted to remind him in the most respectful way. Behind Rebbe, that's when Rabbi Eliezer got really angry. Rabbi Eliezer said to him that you want to stop people from shechting a korban Pesach on Shabbos. It says a pasuk b'moya doi. I feel a b'Shabbos, I feel a b'tumah, and therefore Rabbi Eliezer says that you know what, you should be geschachten. So the Kiva got very concerned, and he said to him, "Al tachvireni, don't go ahead and deny to me b'shas hadim while we're having this discussion over here and tell me you had no choice but to come out and say, but you told us. Kach mekuvay mecha. I heard this from you. Hazor shvus. That is all merely a shvus bein the Shabbos. So therefore, that has nothing to do with Kal V'Chayim being lenient. It wasn't a real Kal V'Chayim. Next question. That's a question. If somebody worships a stalk of wheat, in a case where there's no Avodah Zarah, for example, you worship it after you planted already, or after you planted already. So the question is, it's mutter to a person. Can you use it for a carbon? And the question, can you use it for the Eibishter? In other words, even if you tell me on the previous question I had that there is a problem of never b'mechuber, on a mountain that was worshipped, you cannot use the mountain for things in the base of Mikdash. The question is, over here, there's one step more that you do. Over there, you took the thing, whatever it is, the rock, and you want to use it. Here, you there was a shinui. What grew was wheat, and now you turn it into flour. Do we say that since it's no longer the original state, you've made flour out of it, you ground it, made a flour out of it, and since it wasn't really Avodah Zarah for people, so maybe it's all right to use the base of mikdash. It's no longer recognizable. It's no longer the same thing. That's the question here. So, do we say yes, shini b'never? Do we acknowledge the fact that it's no longer the original wheat, and therefore, if it's no longer the original wheat, it's you can use it in the base of mikdash. It's mutter to hedyet, and it's also mutter to gavaya. We don't accept that this is a shini. When it comes to the laws of gzela, we might accept it as a shini, not when it comes to bring it into the base of mikdash. Let's go ahead and bring a raya from the following. It says, "Kol ha'asud l'gab any animal which is forbidden to mizbeach. For example, an animal that was worshipped, or an animal that was muktzah was set aside for Avodah Zarah. The same mutar. If they give birth to a baby calf, the babies are permitted. And Vitoni Allah Rabbi Eliezer, we learned in the Braise, Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. He asks. Now, what's going on here? What's the machlekes? The lav itmar Allah, did we learn? Amar Nachman, Amar Abahu, machlekes, and all the machlekes is kishenir bu'u ulebesayif ibru. At the time, what do you call? At the time, where the time when the Aveda was done. At the time when the Aveda was done. Okay, let me explain. The Gemara's question originally was that l'chayda, it says it clearly that all the animals on that are also mizbeach cannot use the baby calves are permitted. So doesn't that show that if it's no longer the original form, it's no longer inside the mother's womb, it came out, there's a shinui, you could put it on the mizbeach. You asked the question, if something was a shini, then something without a shini you cannot put in the mizbeach, but something with a shini, can you put it? You see clearly you can. So Gemara says no. You don't understand. You're totally mixing up. It has nothing to do with our case. You know why? Their argument is about the following case. At the time the Avera was done, the animal was not pregnant. It only became pregnant afterwards. And what's the machlekes then? Another thing altogether. We have Pesach in other places, and the concept called Zeh v'Zeh Goyru. The mother is also to the mizbech. She was never. She was used as a Avodah Zarah. The father was never involved in Avodah Zarah, so the father was mutter. The two together joined forces and they created this baby calf. Zeh v'zeh. So if one zeh is aser and one zeh is mutter, what's the status of the baby calf? And that's the machlekes. Nothing to do with shinui or not shinui, and the baby calf was not involved in the Aveda at all. It only happened afterwards. So says the Gemara here. The machlekes is the animal committed first the sin, let's say bestiality, and only afterwards did it fall pregnant. But what happens if the animal was pregnant at the time it committed Aveda? The Dibra Hakasur was also. In other words, we don't acknowledge the Shina. Shina has no bearing on it. Is Hachinami, the same thing say the wheat. That since it was worshipped as a Avodah Zarah, and so for an ordinary person it's all right, but for Hektish it's not all right. So even though you change it into flour, it's no different than the baby calf, and therefore it should be awesome. But so that's one version as to what actually was said. Ikidamri, others say that Mazutra himself said it. That Ikidamri, others say. Machlekes, Rav Zutter himself said, without having, he was told that he was wrong. He himself said, Machlekes kishenir b'lebesayif. Even the same thing. Machlekes is when that first the committed Aveda and then afterwards fell pregnant. I believe it was nirbu, but if it was pregnant first, didn't hakol emerald awesome. Hani here too. Namiki ibel said nirbu dami. So you're telling me that everyone holds that if the Aveda was done first, that baby calf was born. It's also to the Gavaya. You want to compare that to the case of the wheat and turn the flour to also. So how do you compare the two cases? Hasam over there, the calf inside the mother's womb is the same calf that came out. There's no shina here. Merely a door holding it back from coming out. In other words, the animal itself did not go through a shinit. The baby calf did not really go through a shinit. Hoch over here, mikara chiti, the hashkim first grew wheat, and now you turn it into flour. So therefore, we have no resolution there. What would it then be in this case? Is it considered a shinit or not? And we don't resolve the case. Right. Next question. One more question. Bayrish lakish. Hamishtachve. Should we stop here? Maybe we should stop here. Or should we continue? It's up to you. Anybody wants to stay on, learn a little bit more? Hello? Nobody's saying anything? I'll learn a little bit more. Anybody? Okay, Bayrish lakish. One more Bayr. Ishlak had another question. Hamishtachve ledekel. Somebody worshipped a palm tree, which again is not awesome. But lulavay mao, can you use it for a mitzvah? Just like we had a whole discussion, if you can use it for Beis Hamikdash, how to view mitzvahs? Can you use it for a mitzvah or not? The be'ilan should not to mitchil kach the tree lechatchil is planted for Avodah Zarah the loyte boilach. Obviously, don't talk about it. That feel lahedinami asa. Even for hedyet, it's also asa. Now, the truth of the matter is, we're having Gemara Shondav Chavtes that you can, if you use a shayfer shel oila, a shayfer shel Avodah Zarah, all those things we said that l'chatchili shouldn't do, but the evidence are right because mitzvah lav lahanas nitnu. So some want to learn that our Gemara is talking about only l'chatchila, the court talking about l'chatchila should use it, and others want to say no, that this whole Gemara here argues with the Gemara Shoshana and holds that there's no such thing mitzvah lav lahanas nitnu. If it's also bahana, you're not allowed to use it for mitzvah either. Our question is, a tree that was planted and later on you worshipped it. The liba that Rabbi Yossi, later on you worshipped it. And the question is, it's not also to a person, is it also for mitzvah? Now, a liba of course, it's not really the question if it's even forbidden for an ordinary person. Remember, he holds after anything grows afterwards also, unless we're talking about things that grew before you worshipped it, that was already grown. We say that for a hedyet, it's not Avodah Zarah. How do we treat about mitzvahs? Mi mois klape gavoya. Do we say that it's mias to use that for a mitzvah, or not really? Ki also Rav Dimi, and Rav Dimi came along and he had another version of the question. So we'll stop here because this is the next whole Gemara goes till the Mishnah goes not till the Mishnah, but before that goes according to Rav Dimi's question, which is different than what